chair beneath the stars above. For a moment, all the world was right, and how could I have known that you'd ever say goodbye? And now I'm glad I didn't know the way it all would end, the way it all would go. Our lives are better left to chance. I could have missed the pain, but I'd have had to miss the dance. Holding you, I held everything. For a moment, wasn't I the king? But if I'd only known how the king would fall, hey, who's to say? You know I might have changed it all. And now I'm glad I didn't know the way it all would end, the way it all would go. Our lives are better left to chance. I could have missed the pain, but I'd have had to miss the dance. Yes, my life is better left to chance. I could have missed the pain, but I'd have had to miss the dance.
Some of you are singing along. Sounded pretty good. Looking back on your life as a follower of Jesus, both the good and the bad, knowing then what you know now, would you still have chosen Jesus? Would you have done it differently? This is the question the recipients of the book of Hebrews were asking themselves. That's what that letter, the book of Hebrews, is all about. They weren't so sure they'd made the right decision. Things were changing. There was a time when they chose to follow the Messiah. They believed he was the true Messiah. Others didn't believe it, and so they joined together. But they were known throughout the Roman area, the Roman Empire, as a sect of the Jews. The Jews were recognized they could worship, they could meet in peace and in freedom. But then the Jews kicked the Christians out of the synagogues and out of the meeting places. And the Romans began to realize that this Messiah, this Jesus, was not who they thought. Instead, the Christians were saying, he is the true King of Kings and Lord of Lords. He is the true Emperor. He is the true Son of God. And things were beginning to change. It was beginning to be more and more difficult to be a Christian in the world they were living. And some were wondering, do we make the right decision? We look back, we look at all the different things that we did and the festivals and the celebrations that we had, and a lot of that's changing as more and more of the nations of the Gentiles become part of the movement. And they began to wonder, did we do the right thing? How is it with you? Today's message is part 2 of a 4-part series that Pastor Jeff started last week. The title of the series is Final Instructions, Guidance in the Enduring Life of Faith from the book of Hebrews. And it is becoming more difficult to be a Christian in our nation today as well. I think many of you may begin to notice that. The winds are pushing, the headwind is getting stronger. And more you sense that a storm is coming. Now the problem is, as we look at that, many of us looking at it from just the normal human perspective, because everybody in here I've seen so far is human. So consequently, that's how we would do it. Then you begin to wonder, well, how can these things be solved, and how can we hold back the kind of persecution that Jesus said we're going to have? You know, maybe we can hold it off until we're gone in the next generation. Maybe our politicians can help. Maybe if we do this, that, or the other thing. And we got an election year now. So this side, they got the right guy. This side's got the wrong guy. Now, I don't know how you guys look at it. But as I see it, from my perspective looking there, you're on the right, you're on the left, so you're the right guy, right wing, and you're the left wing. But as you look at me, you're on the right side and they're on the wrong side. And that's the problem we have in our nation today. And the ones that more and more are going to have to stand up and say, no, there's a better way, and nobody has it but Jesus, are going to get more and more and more pushback. So, the title of today's message is Looking Back, Leaning on a Great Cloud of Witnesses. We just heard it in the scripture reading. Sometimes it's important for us to stop and think and look back. Who came before us? What did God do in their lives? What is He doing in our lives? And was it better, not left to chance, but is our life better left to faith? Our ancestors and all who have come before have set a path for us. And today we want to ask the question, how can their example spur us onward into the times that we're heading into? Where our passage has already been read, we'll be discussing at Hebrews chapter 11, verses 29 through 12:3. Book of Hebrews, as you know, is known as the faith chapter. It's the one that gives the best overall description of faith, not only because it gives a definition, but also because it gives examples. But the Jewish Christians that it was written to didn't have a chance to read it before it was written. And so consequently, they were in a situation, much as people could be in the same type of situation today. How many people, when things get tough, they say, I made a mistake, and they go back to their old life? That was the whole story of the nation of Israel. One always went back to their old life, no matter how much reform, what the prophet said or anyone else, they always ended up going back to their comfort zone. And being human beings with a nature that is a sin nature without the power of the Holy Spirit, we can all defer back to what is comfortable and even be Christian at it, so we think. So this book of Hebrews, that this is only a 4-part series. This is part 2 today. We're just kind of touching on the latter part of it. But this book of Hebrews is a very, very important letter for all of us today. Now the message is a simple one, because they were beginning to wonder, did we make a mistake in choosing to follow Jesus as radically as we're doing? Stepping out and saying what we're saying, doing the things we're doing in a world and in a society that is going totally against us. And so the writer of this letter, and we don't know who that was, it's anonymous, and consequently guesses have been made, but when all is said and done, everybody admits we really don't know. But this person began in this letter to show why Jesus is so important. And what was written is just as valid and important today as it was back then. We don't have time to read the whole thing. But you can sit down and you can read the letter. You can get the whole letter done and even be thinking about what you're reading in maybe an hour. 13 chapters, but there's depth to it. But get a sense. Basically, in the first 10 and a half chapters, chapter 1 through verse 18 of chapter 10, he brings out these things. First of all, Jesus is the true reflection of God. So Jesus is greater than anything else, any other spirits. Jesus is greater than the angels, which they thought very highly of the angels back then, which we should. Jesus is greater than Moses. That was the system they were under. That's the system we've been under in many ways. The whole Old Testament, the Old Covenant, we went that route too, didn't we, as Worldwide Church of God? And so looking back, which I've been doing lately, we got a call this week. Was it this week or last week? Well, it was one of the weeks of this month. I got a call from an old friend from Germany. They were over visiting in the States. They called and we began to talk and everything like that. And I began to think back there and, spent a little more time watching German TV this week than I normally have done and things like that. And, the memories come flooding back of how good we had it back then. Of course, the whole family together and all the different things, the churches and so on. So much has changed. And you begin to look back. And you begin to look back on that dance. You begin to look back on the good times. You begin to look back on all the things as they were back then. And so much is changing now. And so many warning signs are coming up. So much is different. And it's easy to look back and live in the past. I've heard that when you get old, which I assume I will someday, that you do that more, and reminisce and live in the past and so on. But he was showing them, no, he's better than Moses. He's better than the whole priesthood, that whole system that was set up. He was better than the sacrifice because he is the high priest. He died once for all, at all times. You don't have to go in and have those sacrifices or the special ones on the Day of Atonement for all the people. He did it all, and he's the priest to this day. He's the high priest before God. He represents us to God, and he represents God to us. That's who he is. And the new covenant that we are under, far greater than the old one. Then, from chapter 10, 19 on to the rest of the book, he talks about the superiority of the way of faith. Living life not by chance, as in the song, but living life by faith, so that even if time and chance happen, you know that God is behind it. And God says he's working all things for the good of those who love him. So with that back in mind, let's look back to the great cloud of witnesses who demonstrated the power of faith. That chapter 11, if you want to turn there, we'll talk about it in a little bit, verses 29 and on down. But first of all, we need to discuss what do we mean by faith and what is the faith that matters. Hebrews 11 verse 1 is the definition. Now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and the assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. They were confident in the things that they hoped for because God had said this is how it was going to be. Jesus came, he trained his disciples, and they spread the word. And They were commended by God for what they did. Now, I like to read that definition from the New English Translation. It words it this way. Now, faith is being sure of what we hope for, being convinced of what we do not see. It's a hope. I can't see it, but I know. When we take communion afterwards, we're saying we're doing this because we know. Not only did he die for us, not only did he rise from the dead, not only did he ascend to heaven, but he is going to return. And we do this periodically over and over again, remembering that he's coming back. And therefore, that's why we do what we do. That's who we are. And that's why we're here today. Eugene Peterson, I appreciate the way he explains things. And here's a note that he had on this chapter of Hebrews 11. Faith is the summary word for practical religion. What I love about Hebrews 11, he writes, is that it not only provides a working definition of faith, verses 1 and 2 that we just read, but it also provides numerous examples that illustrate the definition, verses 4 through 40. You can see what it means. It is as if the writer were saying that in order for faith to be faith, it must be lived faith. Something visible, tangible, palpable. It must be walked out a step at a time, a day at a time. And where it must be walked out is not in the roominess of a seminary classroom, but in the rigors of everyday life. This seems to be the thrust of James 2:14 through 26. Don't need to turn there, but I'll read it. This is what James writes. This is how he explains it. James 2:14, what good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? Suppose a brother or a sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith by itself, if it is not accompanied by action, is dead. And then we drop down to verse 26. He goes on to say, you foolish person, do you want evidence that faith without deeds is useless? Was not our father Abraham considered righteous for what he did when he offered his son Isaac on the altar? Now you just stop and think about that for a minute. Every time I do, I think, wow. God says, go offer your son as a sacrifice to me. And he does it. At least gets to the point where he would have done it had God not intervened. And James writes, you see that his faith and his actions were working together, and his faith was made complete by what he did. And the scripture was fulfilled that says Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteous. And he was called God's friend. See, as it says in Hebrews, he really felt God can raise him back again. God promised it's going to happen, so if I'm to offer him, he's going to raise him right back up. It takes a faith that right now I think of that and I think, wow. But the time may come that we need to have that same kind of faith. For many, maybe it's already there. In the same way was not even Rahab the prostitute considered righteous for what she did when she gave lodging to the spies and sent them off in a different direction. As the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without deeds is dead. And then Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 16 that Pastor Jeff read last time. But this is the thing that I think is very important for us to reread today. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on earth. People who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We are living and looking for something that's far beyond anything we can imagine now, but we know it will happen. We may not see it in this life, but it will happen. And what we see throughout all history as God is working and has worked in the lives of his people is that he is there and it's going in the direction that he said it would go. So looking back, let's talk a little bit about those examples that Melinda read to us about today in verses 29 through 12:3 of Hebrews 11. First of all, it talks about by faith the people passed through the Red Sea on dry land, but when the Egyptians tried to do so, they were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell after the army had marched around them for 7 days. Now, what I see here is a reason why we're here today, and we come every week. We see here in these things, I'm sure there had to be an awful lot of group support. What? Go through the sea and they're coming to and go forward and the sea parts? I'm not going to do that. Oh, come on. We can do it, you know. And I mean, we're here to help one another. And sometimes we have situations where our faith is weak and somebody else is stronger and they kind of help us along. What in the world? Walking around this city every day once? That's a long one. My feet are killing me already. And now we got to do it 7 times this next time. What good is that going to be? I'm sure there were a lot of people, let's just, come on, we can do it. We can do it. You know, look, God brought us this far. We got to even, you know, look at all he did. Let's keep going. There's so much needed that we can only accomplish when we do it together. I guess that's why in chapter 10 of Hebrews, verses 23 through 25, the writer says, let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess. That's what we're looking for. For he who promised is faithful. That's Jesus. And let us consider how we may spur one another on toward love and good deeds, not giving up meeting together, as some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. And it's interesting that as we see the day approaching, then things come along like COVID, and suddenly, when you can't go anymore, you get used to not going anymore. And maybe there are other ways. I can even watch it on TV, even though I am healthy enough to go. And all of a sudden, I don't have that group support. Don't have the opportunity every week to get together with my brothers and sisters. We're all human. We all stumble. We all make mistakes. Jesus knows it. He died for it all. It's all taken care of. We'll become perfect on the other side. But right now, with flaws and all, we hold together and help one another to get through what needs to be gotten through. But on the other hand, sometimes you don't have that. Sometimes you're alone against the world. And yet, if you stand firm, he will intervene. That's the example of Rahab in verse 31. By faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with all those who were disobedient. She was the one person in the whole city of Jericho that said, I know that God is God. If I help his people, these spies that have come in, maybe they'll help me and I'll be saved. And my family. And God honored that faith. But then he goes on in verse 32 and says, well, what more shall I say? I don't have time to tell about Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, about David and Samuel and the prophets. I don't have time either. So we'll have to move on from them. But through faith conquered kingdoms, administered justice, gained what was promised, shut the mouths of lions, quenched the fire, the fury of the flames, and you think of some of the different ones, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and so on, escaped the edge of the sword, whose weakness was turned to strength, who became powerful in battle and routed foreign armies. Women received back their dead, raised to life again. There were others who were tortured, refusing to be released so that they might gain an even better resurrection. Some faced jeers and flogging and even chains and imprisonment. No, we're talking about the no-name people that we don't know who they are. But God does, and that's why he made sure this was written down to help us to understand. People don't need to know who we are, but God does, and we're doing it because of him. They were put to death by stoning. They were sawed in two. They were killed by the sword. They went about in sheepskins and goatskins, destitute, persecuted, mistreated. The world was not worthy of them. They wandered in deserts and mountains, living in caves and in holes in the ground. You know, when I read through this week and was thinking about it, it hit me. There are a lot of people who trust in Jesus, but from the get-go, from the time they were born and children, everything seemed to go wrong. And life has been a horrible struggle all the time. If you think about it, you probably know people like that already, and yet they're there. And yet they trust, and yet they keep going, no matter what, because they know someone who is greater than everything, than all. These Oswald Chambers once said this: "Faith for my deliverance is not faith in God. Faith means whether I am visibly delivered or not, I will stick to my belief that God is love. There are some things only learned in a fiery furnace," which is the reason why we have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Johnny Erickson Tada, whom I'm sure most of us are aware, quadriplegic woman who became quadriplegic in a diving accident years and years, 40-some years, even longer ago. She once said this: "We ask less of this life because we know full well that more is coming in the next. The art of living with suffering is just the art of readjusting our expectations in the here and the now. Don't expect that much now. What to expect, that's coming afterwards. We can't even begin to describe how good it's going to be." And then the writer goes on to say, "These were all commended for their faith, and yet none of them received what had been promised, since God had planned something better for us, so that only together with us would they be made perfect." And so it comes even down to today. As you sit in this congregation, those of you who have been around here for a longer period of time, certain names come to mind when we think of those who've gone on before, but who, when I hear that name, I think, wow, good memories come because that person, the way that person was. For those of you who are newer here, you have your own names and people that come to mind that have gotten you to where you are today. I think of names like J.B. Williamson, Lee and Ruby Miller, Isaac and Minerva Yoder, George and Marie Gilkey, Orland and Grace Davis, Dave Slagle, Hartwell and Christine Williams. We all remember Matt Mason, Ray Stewart. Who would forget Dave Tyler? Whenever there was a need, Dave was there. Gary Lowry, and even someone who's still with us but not with us because can no longer come, Ann Miller. People who have formed and helped to form this congregation, make us who we are, and we are still here today because of them. I still remember, can't forget. When I hear the name Orland Davis and Dave Slagle, They're examples to me of this whole idea. Both died on the same day. I had the opportunity to visit them a few times when they were in the hospital toward the end, but especially, I think it was the day before. First I'm with Dave, then I go to see Orland. And Dave was weak. I mean, that cancer had done a number on him. But, you know, you all know Dave. That twinkle in his eye, that was there up to the end. And all of a sudden he looks at me, smiles with that twinkle in his eye, because he knew I was going to go see Orland. Orland in his 90s, but he was the champion horseshoe pitcher in the congregation. And at the church picnics, Dave and Orland always had it out. So Dave raises up, has that twinkle in his eye, smiles at me feebly, says, "You go tell Orland, I challenge him. Next time at our next church picnic," which won't be now, it'll be then, "I challenge him to a game of horseshoes." So I go to see Orland. Orland's dying of pneumonia. And I mentioned that to him. I said, "Orland, Dave told me to tell you this." And he kind of weakly looked at me and he said, "You tell him I accept." So at our first CenterPointe church picnic in the kingdom, we've got to make sure we get some horseshoes there so Dave and Orland can have it out. But again, you're living because you know life goes on. Life goes on. But looking back, we come to the prime example of all. That's Jesus himself. Hebrews 12, verses 1 through 3. I'm reading this time from the God's Word translation. "Since we are surrounded by so many examples of faith, we must get rid of everything that slows us down, especially sin that distracts us." How easy it is to be distracted today by those things that draw us away from Christ. "We must run the race that lies ahead of us and never give up. We must focus on Jesus, the source and goal of our faith. He's the one from whom we get the faith, but he's the one we are striving to become like. He saw the joy ahead of him, so he endured death on the cross and ignored the disgrace it brought him. Then he received the highest position in heaven, the one next to the throne of God. Think about Jesus, who endured opposition from sinners so that you don't become tired and give up. This is how Paul described Jesus and described life because of Jesus in Galatians 2:20. I'm using the New English translation this time. "I've been crucified with Christ, and it is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. So the life I now live in the body, I live because of the faithfulness of the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." So looking back, would knowing then what you know now have made any difference? If you could know exactly what God had planned, would that have made any difference? One last example. Linda Holm, one-time member of the band Dallas Holm and Praise, found a malignant lump on in her breast. Though her faith was strong and she was sure of God's providence, she crumbled emotionally when she heard the news. She underwent a mastectomy and 6 months of chemotherapy. Her husband, musician Dallas Holm, said in an interview, "Sometimes in our valley and in our sorrow, we believe if we just knew what God was doing, that would settle it. I'm not sure that would make any difference." Faith is when you don't know, when it doesn't make sense, when you can't understand, but you trust in God. That is the message of Hebrews chapter 11 for you and for me and all of us as we live our lives as followers of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, who will return. And we celebrate that when we come to the table that he established and said, keep doing this. This is going to give you strength to go forward every time we do it. 1 Corinthians 11, Paul wrote it this way, I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, in the night he was betrayed, took bread. And when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. That's what we're doing now. So we're going to ask God's blessing on the elements, and then you're all invited to come and partake of the bread and the cup, partake of the Lord's Supper.